Let's be honest, history class can sometimes feel like a blur of random dates and boring kings. But the 17th century in England, that wasn't a timeline. It was an absolute political drama. It was a 100-year battle for the very soul of a nation. We're talking revolution, a king's execution, and the birth of an idea that would literally change the world. So let's just start with this central question of this whole story, because it's a wild one. What would it possibly take for a country to not just overthrow its king, but to put him on trial for treason and chop off his head? I mean, really think about that. To understand how things got so extreme, we gotta go back to the beginning of the century. The whole century was basically a powder keg, and the fuse was lit by two ideas about power that are complete opposites. So on one side, you have the king. He believes his power comes straight from God. He doesn't just make the law, he is the law. But on the other side, you've got Parliament, and they're saying, whoa, hold on a minute. A king's power comes from the people, and you've got to follow the same rules as everyone else. There's no middle ground there, right? And when these two ideas collided, England just shattered. All right, so here's where our story really kicks off. Act 1. The legendary Queen Elizabeth I dies without an heir, which means the Tudor dynasty is over. The crown then passes to her cousin, James Stuart, who's already the King of Scotland. So he heads down to England, bringing his family, a pretty thick Scottish accent, and a brand new idea that turns out to be incredibly dangerous. And you have to understand just how radical this divine right thing was in England. For centuries, the English had this tradition that their kings had to follow the law and respect customs. Then James I shows up and basically says, yeah, no, God picked me personally, so I'm above all your little laws. And this wasn't just some philosophical debate. It was a direct challenge to Parliament and to the rights of every single person in England. I love this quote from the King of France. It just perfectly sums up the problem with James. The guy was brilliant, no doubt. He wrote books, he was incredibly learned, but when it came to actually dealing with people and politics, a complete disaster. He was this walking contradiction, the wisest fool in all of Europe, constantly getting into fights with Parliament about, you guessed it, money and religion. And if you thought things were tense with James, oh, just you wait. His son, Charles I, comes along and he doubles down on everything. He has all his father's belief in divine right, but none of the caution. Things go bad fast. Parliament actually forces him to sign a document limiting his powers. So what does he do? He basically says, fine, I don't need you, locks the doors, and rules all by himself for 11 years, raising cash with illegal taxes. By the time he's broke and has to call Parliament back, well, you can imagine they were not in a good mood. And that brings us to Act 2. The talking is done, the arguments have failed. That huge, unbridgeable gap between the king and Parliament finally erupts into a brutal, horrifying civil war that just tore the nation apart. The whole country was split right down the middle. You had the Cavaliers, they were mostly the nobles and country gentlemen, loyal to the king, and then you had the Roundheads, named for their short haircuts, who were the merchants, the city dwellers, and the Puritans, fighting for Parliament. This wasn't some distant conflict. It was neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Now, at first, the king's side, with their experienced officers, was winning. But then, this quiet member of Parliament, a guy named Oliver Cromwell, steps up. And he totally got the problem, as you can see from this quote. He basically said, look, to beat an army of passionate elites, we need an army of our own that's passionate about something even more powerful. For him, that was God. So he built a new kind of army, the Ironsides, based on religious conviction, and they completely changed the war. And this is the moment the entire century had been building towards. After years of fighting, Cromwell's army won. King Charles I was captured, he was put on trial, and he was found guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, and murderer. And then, on a freezing cold morning, right in front of his own palace, the King of England was publicly executed by his own subjects. An event that sent an absolute shockwave across Europe. You can just feel the weight of this moment. What's incredible is that this was written by a poet who was actually an opponent of the king, but even he was struck by the sheer gravity of it all. Charles faced his death with so much calm and dignity that it shook everyone who was there. They hadn't just killed a man. They had smashed 1,000 years of tradition. And the big question was, what now? And that question leads us straight into Act 3, the kingless decade. With the king gone, England launched into one of the most radical political experiments in history. Seriously, just pause for a second and let that sink in. For 11 years, at a time when the rest of Europe was ruled by powerful kings, England was a republic.
The idea itself was completely revolutionary, almost unthinkable. It was a total break from everything that came before, an attempt to build a whole new country from scratch.
So, what did this brave new world look like? Well, it got messy, and it got messy fast. At first, it was called a commonwealth, and it was run by what was left of Parliament, but the whole thing was really unstable. And soon, all the power started to gather around the one guy who had control of the army, Oliver Cromwell. And isn't that ironic? A war fought against one-man rule ended up creating a military dictatorship run by a Lord Protector. So in Act 4, that pendulum just swings right back. When Cromwell died, the whole Republican government just fell apart. The country was exhausted, tired of military rule, tired of the strict Puritan lifestyle. And so they did something amazing. They invited the executed king's son, Charles II, to come back from exile and be king again. The change in culture was just whiplash. It was like the entire country went from black and white to Technicolor overnight. Gone was the grim, sober Puritan era. In came the wild parties, the reopened theaters, and the fun-loving merry monarch, Charles II. But, and this is a huge but, beneath all the glitter and parties, the fundamental problem was still there. Look, bringing the king back didn't magically fix the problem. The core question of the century, who's really in charge here, the king or parliament, was still completely up in the air. Charles II was definitely more clever than his dad, but he was still scheming behind the scenes, even taking secret cash from the King of France so he wouldn't have to deal with Parliament. The conflict was quiet, but it was far from over. And here we go, the final act. Charles II's brother, James II, takes the throne and proceeds to make every single mistake his father made, all over again. Only this time, Parliament had learned its lesson, and this time they had a permanent fix in mind. You almost can't believe how quickly James II messed this up. It was like he had a political checklist of what not to do. He was Catholic in a Protestant country. He ignored Parliament, made up his own laws, and even threw the leaders of the Church of England in jail for disagreeing with him. He managed to unite almost everyone against him, so a group of powerful nobles did the unthinkable. They sent a secret letter to a foreign prince, William of Orange, inviting him to invade England and save them from their own king. And this is what becomes known as the Glorious Revolution. And it was called glorious mainly because it was bloodless. When William landed with his army, James's support just melted away. He fled the country without a single major battle. And then Parliament did something new. They offered the throne to William and Mary. This wasn't a coronation, it was a job offer. And it came with one massive condition. You have to agree to rule with us. This was it, the final settlement, written down and signed into law. The Bill of Rights of 1689 officially ended the 100-year war for power. It stated, once and for all, that Parliament was the top dog. No more raising taxes without permission, no more suspending laws on a whim. The idea of the divine right of kings, it was finally, officially, dead and buried. So we come to our epilogue. After all that chaos, the wars, the revolution, why does any of this matter to us today? Well, because the world we live in, and especially the way our governments work, was basically forged in the fires of this one crazy century. Okay, so let's just break down the legacy. That idea that a government needs the consent of the people it governs, it was born right here. A constitutional monarchy, where the monarch is a head of state but doesn't actually run the show, established here. Even the first real political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, grew out of this fight. All these core principles, protection from a ruler doing whatever they want, the rule of law being supreme, they became the blueprint for modern democracies, including, and this is crucial, the United States. At the end of the day, the 17th century was all about hammering out a new deal, a new balance of power between the people and the state. And that leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on. In our own time, with all the new challenges we're facing, how healthy is that deal today?